Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 80th episode of Beyond Talking Points with Matt and Matt. Um, Today, we are going to have a conversation based on two videos uploaded by the YouTuber Cosmic Skeptic. Well, originally, I just suggested we talk about the dichotomy between objective morality and subjective morality. And then I remembered that Cosmic Skeptic had uploaded two videos. One where he argues that you can't even have subjective morality if God exists. Now, Cosmic Skeptic is a notable atheist YouTuber, so he doesn't think God exists, but he's just posing the hypothetical. And then he takes on in the second video Sam Harris's The Moral Landscape, which is a very popular or was a very popular work because it sort of, well, the sort of the mitwit Christian like attack on atheists is, and in fact, I think Cosmic Skeptic shows a video clip of like William Lane Craig, where the Christian or the Muslim or the Orthodox Jew is saying, well, you have to believe in God and heaven and hell, because without God and without reward and punishment after death, then morality means nothing, and it doesn't matter that the Nazis committed genocide. It doesn't matter that all these other atrocities throughout history occurred, because life is meaningless, and we're just an accidents, and there's no guide to our lives. So that is sort of like where I first started thinking about moral questions, being someone who was influenced by the New Atheists as a kid. But in the so that's the sort of jab that people take at a lot of atheists. But Cosmic Skeptic isn't willing to, well, he doesn't accept the jab, because his whole stance is you can't really define concepts like good and bad. You just sort of, we sort of recognize them as like linguistic shortcuts for like ideas or concepts, but I think Cosmic Skeptic would say there aren't really like concepts in the same way that a tree is a concept or the number 4 is a concept. There's sort of these weird, almost undefinable terms. And so if you can't define these terms, then you have to sort of define them based on assumptions. So like he attacks Sam Harris in the second video, because like I think this the example he quotes like Sam Harris's from Sam Harris's Twitter page, and he quotes Sam Harris as saying, well, you shouldn't, if you just trust my assumption that like suffering is bad, then you should put your hand on a hot stove and get back to me. But Cosmic Skeptic would say to Sam Harris, that doesn't, you are making an assumption, and that's not necessarily an objective assumption. But at the end of the video, or the end of the series, Cosmic Skeptic does say that just because morals are subjective doesn't necessarily mean we have to throw out moral language altogether. So that's sort of a synopsis of his views. I guess before I jump in, I'd like to hear some of Matt's thoughts, and if he he pulled anything from those videos that I missed, I'd like to hear that as well.
Yeah. So, one of the points he starts with is that the idea of morality is like recognizing what is good and bad, and then kind of that it should indicate what you ought to do, and what you ought to do should be what is good, and like what you shouldn't do is bad. But the issue he's kind of pointing out and what you kind of hit on is that good and bad are like have value judgments baked into them, right? So given that they have these types of value judgments, it's not definable like tree is, right? It's not a categorical thing that you can just point to and say these are the qualities that make it good or bad, because they have these implicit subjective valuations within them. So if you're talking about morality, and morality is based on a subjective valuation in a way, then how can you really have it? The hand on the stove issue is kind of saying a lot of people seem to share this intuition, but that isn't what makes it true. It's more of like we can act as if it is true, given that it's true more often than not. Because in a way, an opinion, even though it's a subjective thought, if I say that my co-host here, Matt, if I said Matt hates Marvel movies, it's not indicative of the quality of Marvel movies. It's like a factual statement of your opinion. So if I say a burning stove inflicts suffering on me and I don't like it, that's like an objective statement in a way to some sort of degree that I think is bad. And a lot of people happen to share that opinion or that feeling or that reaction or intuition, but it doesn't make, if you put your hand on a stove, it's bad, objectively true in almost like a Kantian way of like every person as like an axiomatic way. You can't show that, right? They're like, why couldn't somebody someday say, no, I like this, right? And that's why it doesn't, the majority doesn't prove the rule, and a majority can't prove the rule because it's, you can imagine the exception to the rule. So this isn't something that is like objectively true in this way. Now, then that, as you mentioned, he kind of says, well, what should we do about this? And he kind of, it's not really a walk back. And I think that's where boomer cons kind of trip over themselves, because it's okay to say that you can't say it's objectively true that the stove interacts with your hand in this way. You can't say it is objective. But it's not a walk back to then say we can act as if it is true, because everybody I've ever met in my life has that reaction. So it's fair to say I can still make guidelines based on the plurality subjective viewing of this. But to call it objective is like a philosophical error, right? And Sam Harris's whole point is he's trying to play the BoomerCon game, where he's trying to refute the religious people that say, well, you can't have objective morality, so the Holocaust wasn't a bad thing. And then Sam Harris tries to kind of like play their game and meet them where they're at. And in reality, it seems to me that it's not important to play their game. It's to point out that you're making a nuanced point about value judgments, right? And there is something there that needs to be recognized. Maybe that argument's not really necessary, and it might even be missing the point when you're talking to people like religious conservatives. But Sam Harris still tries to square that circle. And I think that's why he ends up making the same error, that it needs to be objective in that way for it to be a good enough answer. And I kind of am falling in the territory that you can't have those types of objective answers, and that's okay. You can still get as close as you can in certain ways with reason, right? So that's kind of how I'm feeling about it. I'm not sure how you're going to feel about it, especially as we kind of delve in. But that's kind of my starting point in this conversation.
So I think where I start, I think I'm pulled in two, not contradictory directions, but I think I'm like trying to unpack two problems here. So I'm trying to think about whether morality, like I'm trying to put on like my logician's cap and sort of try to understand the phenomenon of morality and of ethical theories as comprehensively as possible, and try to understand like what claims are being made when someone makes an ethical claim, and how do they justify that claim, and can these claims be justified? And then there's the my I guess identity as a human being in the world that has to make decisions and has to have some code of conduct to I guess make sense of my behavior and other people's behavior, and try to make decisions that are beneficial to me and my loved ones, or improve my life and improve their lives in certain ways. um I don't know, and I think those are like two hard, like whether like those questions pull you in different directions. I think it can be difficult to reconcile uh the different intuitions that each of them pull me towards. So, if I really try to think about it like the philosophers, if I really try to strip moral claims down to the bare bones, I can't really find any way of calling those claims true or false. I think I tend to think of truth claims as either, um, and the British philosopher A.J. Ayer made this distinction, like conceptual truth claims, such as all bachelors are unmarried. The the words sort of define each other. A bachelor is an unmarried man, therefore it's a tautology. Or an empirical claim such as the Earth revolves around the sun. I don't think, if I say, if I make the statement murder is wrong, I don't think there's wrongness exists in the world. I don't think wrongness exists in nature. So I can't really, offer it as a truth claim to that extent. And then conceptually, murder just refers to the act of killing another person. And I don't think that word itself doesn't include in it, the concept of wrongness. So that is sort of where I'm stuck. I'm stuck with the first part of the problem.
So to walk back a couple steps and to allude to something you mentioned earlier on, and this is something I thought was interesting, is in that Cosmic Skeptic video, he does kind of say that the subjective objective morality stuff it shouldn't be affected by if we were under the impression that a God existed and whatnot on that front. And I found this interesting because one time off air, you and I were having a conversation about reality or something of the sort, and I kind of implied that I don't think a God existing would change it would change the outlook in a lot of ways. So here's a comparison of maybe why, and this might be like way off the beaten path, but I think it's relevant. Are you familiar with the Back to the Future movies at all? I don't know if you've seen those. So there's this whole thing that happens, I think, in the second one, I believe, where the Biff gets a sports almanac from the future, and then he goes back in time, and then it's like, cool, now he has all these results of games that haven't happened yet, so he can bet on them and make a ton of money. And I've joked with my buddies that the issue I have with, like, if you woke up tomorrow and you were 5 years in the past, right? The issue, and this is an epistemological issue, is based on all these movies, your first assumption is, oh, I'm 5 years in the past. That means everything going forward will be the same as the reality I just came from. So when Biff gets the almanac and goes back in time, the games still happen the same way as they did in the almanac, unless there's some fan theory about the almanac changing or something, because it's some artifact that exists in a hybrid time and space loop or something. That's aside the point. The point is, if I woke up and I was, 20 all of a sudden, and I was like, I'm going to gamble on the election because I know who won these elections. I'm going to put $3,000 on somebody and win $6,000. I'm assuming that for whatever reason, I'm in like the same, universe or whatever. This isn't to make a time travel point. This is to make the point that if God came out of nowhere and he said, like, these are the holy scriptures, they are good, how can I trust my senses enough to trust that God is good, even if he tells me that he's good and I get some sort of proof? There's always this gap of trusting your instincts and what you know. That is always going to happen in any perception, because things at any time can be shown to you or told to you as if they are true, yet many things are not true, right? Or incorrect in a material way. So if you wake up, in the past and you think the future is concrete, even if you think the future is concrete, it might not actually be concrete. The same applies to if God, you had a spiritual experience and God told you something. Well, what if that is not concrete in the way that you've been led to believe it's concrete? So I think this type of certainty is like impossible to have on an abstract level. No matter how certain you feel, all of a sudden, for some reason, these things can be upended for a reason that you don't understand because there are limitations on our knowledge. If somebody told me that there was some infinitesimal chance that gravity stopped at midnight and all of us got flung into the universe, and then there was actually some sort of constant that could explain it if humanity wasn't wiped out in that instance, it just hadn't been discovered yet. I'm not in a place to say that couldn't happen, right? Because there is always an abundance of knowledge that is beyond my conceptual nature, especially given that we only operate in, so many dimensions of perception, and we still have monkey brains to some extent. So that kind of thinking is why I'm more okay with being, in a philosophical sense, anti-objectivism. Because it's like, how can I trust that I'm understanding these things to the fullest degree? I know that you were kind of playing up the linguistic angle, and I kind of strayed from that. And I didn't mean to run away from that point, because I do think I think that is a similar problem, but in the way that it kind of goes all the way down. Because I'm pretty much saying we have limitations, so we can't know. So everything could truly be wrong. How could we know? The same goes for language, right? If everything is infinitely self-defining, how can we know things in an absolute way, even though we can't in practice? I think these are fair points, right? So I'm agreeing there.
No, I mean, well, your point's not. I mean, your point's actually quite relevant because I'm glad you brought up, how when Cosmic Skeptic says God wouldn't give us objective morality either, because, and I don't think this is from lack of imagination on my part, but I couldn't imagine a universe existing where moral knowledge, like, what was even possible, because I don't know what moral knowledge means or is. And no matter how advanced we get technologically, no matter how much we understand about the physical and chemical and biological and sociological and psychological laws that govern the universe and man, none of these like debates about is war just, and any other any list of ethical dilemmas that people talk about, the centuries of debate just goes on and on and on, and I think that's just because it's not. There's really no way to define the terms properly, or at least there's no way that I'm satisfied. Then no one has given me a definition, for good or bad or right or wrong that I would be satisfied with at an intellectual level. At some level, I'm afraid that at best, maybe morality would be a noble lie, or at worst, it would just be utterly meaningless word salad. So I'll let you jump in.
See, so this is where you and I don't want to. You might have to clarify. This is where you start to stray from the arguments in the videos we were talking about, because he pretty much says, despite that these things can't be put in these types of objective high level terms, he is still willing to make certain types of moral claims, and he doesn't have a problem with it. And you'll have a chance to clarify, because I know that you're still willing to make some moral claims, so you're going to square that somehow. But I do think that I do think the objective nature of it is an interesting topic, given that it's like there are reasons to think it's impossible. Yeah, I don't see why that would have any types of broad implications, I guess. for the same reasons why I think it's okay to make all sorts of claims given uncertainty, or given a lack of absolute certainty, if that makes sense. So I guess what I'm getting at is, even though I'm willing to cede that there's like certain types of inherent errors to human cognition that make any type of objective like knowledge impossible, I almost think that's like misleading, because that's inherent to being human given our like limitations in cognition. I don't think that really undermines morality. I almost think that's just like recognizing the environment we have to operate in. And then I think, given the limitations, we know things that get adjacent to these. It's almost like we have workarounds, I guess, or like I don't want to get into the understanding the physical world too much, but maybe we will. But to some degree, it's like I can't trust my perception of, say, like my desk in front of me, because I don't know what it truly means for something to be perceived by like my eyes, right? I don't really know what its like true nature is beyond what I can perceive as a human. Yeah, I'm still able to do things as if it's a desk, right? So, and that's okay. It doesn't really matter, and it doesn't mean my desk can be something that my desk like my desk can't really be a football. And I know that, and I can still be like, okay, so this desk isn't a football, it's a desk. So I can understand what it is enough in the relevant realm, beyond not understanding its true ultimate nature on like beyond human perception. So I think I'm not willing to make the claim that morality is different from that, even though I made my previous comments about like quote unquote objective morality. And that's kind of what I think the trap of the conversation is. So that's why it's I think that's why it's tricky. But yeah, feel free to clarify what you think on that front.
I mean, I guess my main contention with that part of your argument would be, I think I guess I just like, I'm really thinking about like moral claims here. I mean, a table and a football. I mean, I can touch, I can smell, I can see, but if I say, I mean, when libertarians or ANCAPs make the statement "taxation is theft," I mean, and I'm sort of repeating myself here, so forgive me, but that's not a statement that I think is can be a demonstrated appealing to your senses, and to say that that's in like to say that you could like prove that that's inherently a moral act. Well, then like what like epistemology are we using, or how are we even defining our terms here?
Yeah.
So
I think I think the big difference that we're getting at is it's so I'm willing to grasp the concept that the phrases like "what is right" and "what is wrong" cannot be defined literally, in the sense that they have implicit value judgments to place something in the right and wrong category. So it's like, well, how can you define what is wrong? It's like, it's hard to give a literal definition of that, because it's based upon value judgments of what you think is wrong. Although I don't know, if I think harder about it, maybe that doesn't have to be true. But I guess what I'm willing to say is, once I cede that right and wrong exist, I think you can build a moral worldview. So I think you just have to see those things exist, and it's okay that they exist. And it's like, I almost think you can't prove they exist, for the same reason why I can't tell you certain types of objective facts, like I can't tell you in what way my TV truly exists. Like, I can't really tell you that, but it's like, well, I interact with my TV, so I know it exists. But like, every human with consciousness experiences certain things as being right or wrong, even if they disagree on them from culture to culture. Right and wrong still seem to exist. So it's like, I think you can start, if you can accept that right and wrong exist, period, then we can have a conversation, and then I could say, okay, now what do we do, knowing that those things exist, and how do we go from there? Now, if you say, I'm not sure right and wrong exist, then that's where it's kind of tricky. Because I think saying that every human, with the exception of sociopaths, and like cultures are built on this, and almost all like high level emotional discussions are about right and wrong. It's like, sure, you can say it's a spook for the reason that you can't prove it in like an objective sense, but I almost think nothing can be, yet we still exist. So I'm willing to see right and wrong exist, and then I can work from there. If that can't be seated, then it's like, well, sure, you might have a problem. I just don't think it's any more valid to say, no, Matt, everybody experiences it and that's not good enough. It's like, well, then nothing's good enough ever, because we're humans and our cognition is just low, and we're not omnipresent. Like there is no way to know it. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I feel like that's not a better, like, I don't think that's a more reasonable thing to say, I guess.
So I mean, I'm not willing to see that right or wrong exist, because uh, 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 I mean, like okay, so it's what is true, I guess, or a true statement I'm willing to make, or truth statement that I think could be verifiable, is that humans are social animals, and social animals sort of, there's pressure on their behavior by the other animals that they associate. So, you know, lions live in packs that are fairly hierarchical. Jordan Peterson would say human beings are also supposed to live hierarchically by nature, and so it's like, I mean, okay, here's a perfect example. Evolutionary psychologists can easily account for why the incest taboo exists, because obviously an incest is a threat to the gene to a healthy gene pool. A healthy gene pool is, necessary to pass on your genes, and so if you want the necessary amount of genetic diversity to have biologically viable offspring, then you want to then some trait or gene or something's going to be selected in human beings for them to avoid incest, right? But I still can't help but adding that, that autistic point, which is, just because I might be programmed to dislike X doesn't mean X is wrong, or doesn't mean, just because I'm programmed to do X doesn't mean X is right, because I might have said this example before on a different podcast, but chimpanzee tribes have been known to massacre each other. And of course, most of people would say, no, it's massacring a group of people is wrong. So you can't really appeal to, nature, I don't think. And I also don't think you can really necessarily appeal to just everyday experience when we're talking about truth claims, because like I said, I think then we're just sort of having a noble lie, where it's like, this isn't really true, but we should pretend it is true, which is basically sort of Kant's defense of morality, of God, and of other, concepts that Europeans took for granted.
So I think, okay, so I'm kind of sitting at the point where, and this is to be more, I guess, to like try to organize what we're arguing. I think both of us are making an assertion, and I don't think it's fair to hold those assertions to different standards, because in a way you're saying there is no moral right or wrong, and I'm saying there is a moral right or wrong, and then you're kind of making a negative argument, and I'm making a positive argument. Yet in a way, since we're both starting from zero, I think we're both making positive arguments. It's like an aesthetic is tricking our brain, because yours is taking a negative, that it's not still an assertion. And I guess the thing I'm thinking is, I'm thinking, okay, if these are the two options, because this is a yes or a no, like these are binary in the sense that one is like, the only difference is one is a has a plus and one has a minus. Um, I think there's more evidence in my mind to point to a right and wrong quote unquote exists. And I don't feel like appealing to human experience is necessarily incorrect to do. Um, and I feel like I would have agreed with you on almost an aesthetic level, because a lot of low level discourse in social issues right now is people using the phrase my human experience or my lived in experience in a way that is like very misleading and pandering. But it's like if every human um, is programmed to think in a certain way with a certain level of observation, and this is like constantly how they interpret their actions, to say that's not real is almost like deeply absurd. Like, because it's almost like the most real thing, which is why I think it's kind of a funny conversation to have, because it's kind of like, well, are things that are the most real actually not real, even though everybody thinks it's the most real? And that's why it's kind of odd. Now, you're trying to make like a natural argument for it, which I'm almost kind of would go about it in like and this is why I'd be triggering to people, but like in a way of looking at it through reason, or logic. And then I'd be like happy to hear other viewpoints about it that are like attempting to actually walk through it and try to think of a good standard, because it's like we all act in this way as if right and wrong exists. Like there are sociopaths that don't. Does that mean right and wrong don't exist? It's like, well, sociopaths are the narrow exception. But I don't think it's because we're group animals. Maybe that's why I'm kind of not reacting to that point. I mean, we are group animals, but the point I would make is we all experience life from our individual perspective. So even though we act in groups and we make decisions in groups, that like they have the group decisions rise from the individuals agreeing to be in the group and so forth. So it's like base level one is the individual experience of the world. And it's I just feel like it's anti evidence to discard that people operate through a moral framework. So even if you say that's not objective, it's like, sure, it's not objective, but because it's the core to human consciousness, it exists. It's like, of course, we can't perceive it beyond that because we're humans and our cognition only can experience a certain amount. And anything existing has limitations on the objective front, which is why I've kind of already agreed with that. But since it's the root of like all action by all people, even though it leads to different conclusions, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So that's why I'm like, I'm stuck on that point, I guess. Like it has to exist if that's the way that people process decisions, and it's like inherent to human consciousness. Like saying it doesn't exist like rejects that.
So I would put well. So I mean, just because people share certain assumptions, either like like either through their environment, or I don't know, if you're like the if someone believes that that the mind just has certain ideas built into it, like I mean, I brought up Kant earlier, and it's like, well, Kant's whole point was, that our mind structures, our experience, and we can only think in the confines of our mind. But yes, it is true that people have value systems that they think that they would say mean a lot to them, and that affect their conduct. And as I said, I think that's sort of that would be like a biological or an anthropological observation. But my argument, still holds on to, that's not the same thing as right or wrong existing. It's sort of a certain behaviors might be, detrimental to, certain behaviors might have been detrimental to our ancestors' survival when they were still tribes and, hunter-gatherer tribes in the African savannah. That has nothing to do with the concepts of right or wrong. It's like I could see I could imagine a scenario where, someone in the tribe randomly kills someone for extra food. I don't know. And then that person gets exiled from the tribe or gets murdered themselves. And it's like, sure, that's a biological function, I guess, but I still don't see that as the concept of right or wrong existing. And I wouldn't even say, I would not go so far as to say that morality is the core of human consciousness, but that's sort of a whole other kettle of fish.
I'd probably be willing to walk that back too. But okay, so hear me out. And this is like a sidestep because I think it might illustrate a point and might be able to move us forward. So that's why I'm interested in saying it. I think part of the point that you're making is more of an indictment, not on morality, but on value judgments. So this is the attempt, and I feel like I've probably used this example before because I like this example. But like if we're talking about movies, right? And you and I both watch a movie with like a relative of mine who decides who's very dumb. Let's say we all watch the movie, and the movie is Castaway with Tom Hanks, right? And so opinions about the film are subjective, right? So we watch it. You tell me, you're like, that was a pretty good drama. There were a couple heartfelt moments. It didn't really click for me. You think it's okay. I'm like, wow, that movie really pulled me. I really loved those moments that you thought were okay. Those really moved me deeply. I think those are top 10 moments in film. That's one of my favorite movies. And then my buddy says, I think when a guy talks to an inanimate object like a volleyball, it's kind of gay, and I don't like it. That was a 0 out of 10. So we provided 3 different like subjective opinions on about a film, and then the value of the film cannot be deemed in some weird abstract objective way, in like this like this big picture beyond human comprehension. It's hard to imagine there's like this objective value, but similar to the stove example, we know that when people hear out arguments, some appear more reasonable than others. Like if there's a fourth person who said Castaway was a bad movie because my dog ate a lot of grass yesterday and then puked while I was watching the movie and I found that upsetting, then we'd say, okay, that doesn't make any sense. How can that have to do with it? And then he could say, well, that's my opinion. So like we're willing to operate in a world that some arguments are more convincing than others. And although we are more predisposed towards opinions because of certain elements of our background or our culture or whatever, I think it's fair to say that on some sort of level that is valid, it is okay to say some opinions are better opinions than others. Because if you said it's okay, and then the other guy said, I don't like the movie because my dog puked while I was watching it, so I hate that movie, and they're being dead serious, it's like, okay, well, Matt's opinion is a more valuable opinion. These are all value judgments. We choose to make them and prioritize them. So I guess what I'm kind of getting at is if somebody attempts to tell me why something is wrong or right, and they attempt to build a framework, I think some frameworks are going to be more convincing than others. Now, although I can't ultimately say, Matt, that your opinion on Castaway is better than the guy whose dog puked, I can't ultimately say that in an objective way. But I can sit there and say, okay, I've sussed it out. I've heard both of your arguments. This one is much more compelling because I have human reason that I could apply to the art I observed, right? So I think people could attempt, and it's a lofty goal, but they can attempt to derive things like what makes an action right or wrong. And I think as a person with reason, I can sit here and scrutinize the arguments and say, this is a better argument. And because we cannot make ultimate objective statements, these arguments attempting to derive it are better than other arguments. Now, you can point out the cultural baggage. You can point out anthropological baggage. Those things should be taken into consideration. But just because they exist doesn't undermine the point that some arguments can be better than others. Now, you can say, Matt, that's just your opinion. And it's like, yes, that's true. It is my opinion. That's not a tainting subject. Like the fact that something is a value statement doesn't ultimately taint it, for the same reason why your opinion on Castaway is better than the guy whose dog puked, so he hates Castaway. So I'm willing to say that about value judgments. I don't think that's a wise all the way down problem. I really don't, because in practice it clearly doesn't matter. So it's like we know that that's acceptable. You have to deal with it because that is the nature of reality. That's fine. A lot of things are value judgments. That doesn't mean all value judgments are equal. If somebody tries to tell you all value judgments are equal, there's like a reason why that doesn't pass the smell test. And it's because of the example I just gave. So I guess what I'm saying is I kind of want to hear you contend with the idea of value judgments being unequal, because I think that might make it harder for you to say certain things can't be reasoned, because once you admit that some value judgments are better than others, then it's like, cool, then we could at least start trying to figure out what these words mean, and then we could apply reason to it, and then try to take into account our baggage. Now, you might not find any of the arguments interesting. That's a whole nother topic. Like, there could potentially be one that was interesting.
I mean, so I don't really think reason does have much to do with it, actually. But that's not even an indictment of reason, because I'm really saying, I mean, I think the heliocentric view of our solar system, I think I could rationally demonstrate, or I think Galileo rationally demonstrated that is a better model for our universe than the geocentric model of our universe. But I'm really confining the argument to how do we create rational arguments on morality. And I have yet to find a convincing argument that, it is reason really that is at the basis of morality. I think a lot of it is, a lot of it boils down. Well, I mean, a lot of it boils down to culture. A lot of it boils down to just emotion. If I say I don't like if I say torture should be illegal, or no, I'm sorry, rephrase that. If I say torture is wrong, what I'm really saying is, ew, I don't like torture. I don't like the thought of torture. I don't like the when I think about torture, I don't like the way it makes me feel. That makes me feel icky or yucky for whatever reason. That doesn't mean my statement is at all true. It doesn't also mean that my statement is at all false. I think truth and falseness don't really even apply in this in the context of moral claims.
Okay, I think I have a point that might be helpful. Okay, so I think, and this is something that I think you're doing in good faith, but I think this is how it's clicking in my brain. I'm not making an argument that most people even interpret morality through reason. That's not the argument at all. I guess I'm trying to say the best arguments for morality would be through a reason framework. So a lot of people operate under intuitions, and then they say something that's a moral claim, and it's a post hoc rationalization of something that is likely informed by their upbringing. I'm not going to dispute that. I guess what I'm saying is, if I wanted to actually attempt to define what is right or wrong, going about pointing at how certain people act that way, and a lot of people act that way even, I think that misses the point. Because if we're trying to define or put meat on the bones of what is right and wrong, it doesn't matter how the average person reacts, given that most of what we know in even like political arguments, any argument that's supposed to be based on reason and evidence evaluation, is mostly intuitions and post hoc rationalizations. So pointing that out is like a straw man. You're kind of saying like all the people who aren't really thinking about it interpret morality in this way. And it's like, yes, but if we truly think about it, could we work towards something that is more true, even though it's still subjective and not objective? So it's like, yes, I agree that most people do that, but that's not the point. If we wanted to try to articulate what the most objective, subjective morality is, I think we could do that, even though all those other people might have incorrect views based on what we even came up to. And we could say it's because of their culture, and that's fine. But I guess I'm trying to say, if we try to derive somebody, it doesn't matter that those people interact with the world in that way. Like, I think that's a side point, which is fine. I just don't think that has anything to do with deriving it.
No, I think I maybe I didn't. I think I confused us a bit. Because I wasn't even trying to say that the average person moral framework is based on emotions. I'm saying that all morality is based on emotions, and that ethical systems are practically nonsensical. That was what I was trying to get at.
Okay,
it's not just the blowhard down the street. It's everyone from the most brilliant philosophers throughout history to that blowhard down the street, whose emotional furniture, or their mental furniture is causing them to believe certain things are right and certain things are wrong.
So I think one of the reasons why I'm not sympathetic to your claim is if somebody said we need to derive an axiom to start from to talk about morality. You're kind of saying my axiom is there is no axiom. And I think that's almost as much of a claim as trying to make some sort of axiomatic claim. Like, I think that is one. So because I'm not predisposed towards yours, and I think yours like defies human experience, I'm not sympathetic to it. Now, like, the reason why I'm sympathetic towards natural rights is because if you say us humans can't have access to objective knowledge, but the best here's a trigger word, the most reasonable place to start is based on, say, something that is something that is consistent across all human experience, such as we all perceive things from our, our own eyes. We all interact in our own consciousness, and everything we do starts with us, right? So like every time I move, it's because I move or have the illusion of thinking I'm directing myself to move or something of the sort. It's like, okay, I think that is a place to start. And that's why I think a lot of things based on autonomy are like not really a stretch if you have to construct a morality. And I think that's better than saying no morality, which defies, everything that has to do with being human, I guess. So it's like it's impossible to root the objective, which is fine. So if we have to try to get as close to making any type of reasonable claim, we have to start at the most reasonable place. Now, I'm open to other axioms being used, but I feel like no axiom is just as much of an assertion. And I'm just like, I don't get how that makes sense. Like, I don't think anything I said was weird jibber jabber. Like, I think that's like a fairly reasonable point. It's like, well, we all experience the world in this way, and we all perceive autonomy. So maybe that's a good place to start when we construct morality. And that seems to line up with thousands of years of like cultures and civilizations. So even though some are going to be misguided, and we can say, hey, these things were bad, it's not hard to like kind of use like the Lindy principle to figure out some things that are as close to true as possible, maybe. And I'm not against that way of looking at it if you're going to try to get as close to possible as objective, given that objective is impossible.
So I guess where I'm stuck is I don't know what the measuring stick is that we're taught. Like if I'm, if someone's trying to convince me that the, axiom I need to start with is human autonomy, I don't know what the measuring stick we're using to evaluate that statement, because there's a bunch of other axioms out there and everyone thinks their axiom is the right axiom. And I know you said earlier, like not all value judgments are created equal. And I would agree with you. For most subject matters. But when it comes to morality, I don't have a way to evaluate, the different ethical statements, because I don't know how, I don't know where this truth value is coming from. So.
Yeah, I almost feel like that's something I would engage with, right? So someone said my framework is about minimizing harm. Then it's like, okay, well, we can work through minimizing harm, and then we can think about like what that axiom implies in that sentence, and then we can compare it to other axioms. I just think that's like a much better and a much more like helpful way, or it's not even helpful, but I think that's much more like as close to true as you can get way of dealing with the issue of morality than just pretending like it doesn't exist. Because it's like the only way it doesn't exist is I think the same way that my shirt doesn't exist. And it's like, well, it doesn't exist because I can't prove that my shirt exists beyond saying, well, it exists in human perception, which is good enough.
But how are we evaluating the axioms? That's what I'm asking.
Well, see, what I guess I'm getting at is human reason is good enough. So it's like certain arguments hold up under scrutiny better, just like the whole Castaway argument. Now, when I was talking about,
I don't think that applies to morality, is what I'm saying.
I guess what I'm saying is it's much harder because it's not an obvious of this one's clearly wrong in an obvious way, or clearly nonsensical in an obvious way, and this one's clearly sensical. But if somebody says like, I guess I don't want to get too down the rabbit hole on any specific close arguments, right? That is actually like highly debated, because I'm sure people have better arguments. I don't want to straw man anything. right? So I'm not really trying to turn this into an autonomy versus consequentialism debate where I have to steel man both points and then explain why that one wins out, because I don't want to straw man anybody. But I guess what I'm saying is, if I paint you something absurd as an axiom, it would strike you as absurd, and that's because it's okay that it strikes you as absurd. It's good enough in of itself that if I said like that the axiom of human morality is whatever like a 2-year-old infant points to in terms of wrong or right when we say an action in front of them, and then we list them and then call it good. It's like, why does that seem absurd? It's like, well, because we don't trust a 2-year-old's judgment to make moral claims, because we're not even sure would understand what questions we ask it. Why would you trust a random 2-year-old over any other random 2-year-old? Like, these things are very like obscenely arbitrary. So some things are less arbitrary than others, right? Like, you're willing to grant that. Now, I think you're making a good case for why, when we're talking about serious ideologies, it might be tougher to suss out, which is why like a lot of people are kind of not predisposed to one or the other if you actually force them to like read literature on it.
So I'm trying to think of the best way forward through this conversation, because I'm probably just repeating myself at this point in a lot of ways. So I view ethical systems. Okay, so I know you said you don't want to like defend or criticize any particular ethical system, but I guess I will say, I think all ethical systems, at the end of the day, we have to, they're fantasies. They're just sort of concoctions in our head that we use to justify after the fact some instincts or some emotional reactions. I mean, those emotional reactions might be very important to you or to me or to our culture, but I don't think a coherent morality exists. And I mean, and Sam Harris, I think he acknowledged this in the debate against Jordan Peterson. Like, eventually, as and you mentioned this as well, eventually you have to, you have certain bedrock intuitions or axioms that you can't prove. So I just don't think rationality or logic are amenable to the conversation here. I think there are plenty of other things which are amenable to logic and reason, not moral claims.
I don't want to sound like I'm being stuck, but I think this just maybe the inclusion of one part of what you said kind of bothers me. But I don't think everything is a post hoc rationalization. So a lot of things we do are post hoc rationalizations, but it isn't inherent to everything. And I guess and this is to make a point, but plenty of people and plenty of civilizations find that the way they reason through something contradicts their culture, and that's why they want to change their culture, right? So it's not like everything is to serve to justify something like retroactively. I think not. So I think post hoc rationalizations happen all the time, usually when we're on autopilot. But I don't think they serve a role in this conversation beyond talking about what people do most of the time. If you're actually talking about intellectuals pursuing a framework, that can apply, certainly. But I wouldn't say that it's like inherent. So that's something that I want to reject.
I think what I'm meaning is, or I think what I'm trying to say is, each of us has sort of this, like I think if you ask most people, they could probably sketch out what they say maybe their ideal world would be. And so I'm saying that a lot of our moral arguments sort of come down to like preferences. Like, oh yeah, I would prefer to live in a country where X is legal, or I prefer to live in a country where this institution is abolished. And we can use. I think reason ends up being a smokescreen in a lot of these conversations, which is why
I agree in a lot, but I don't think it's the rule. That's why I think it's so strong.
I think it is the rule. That's what I'm saying. I think it is.
I have plenty of preferences that I don't think are moral, and I wish they were, because it could make my life a lot easier. Like, I mean, you could make all sorts of things about, like, imagine any type of man who's falls in the tropes of being like a misogynist, and then they could say all sorts of things about like how their preference is to have 5 wives, but even in their head, they might not morally condone that in some sort of way. So it's kind of like I don't think I don't think it's always the tail getting wagged here or the head, where you know what I mean.
But I think you're sort of
that's
implying in
often how
that
it goes.
comment. I think you're sort of implying that comment that there's like this idea of like platonic idea of right or wrong, but other people's preferences don't always live up to that platonic ideal in someone's head.
Well, it's just like how people can be wrong about what the right policy to pursue is for a consequentialist goal. They can also be wrong with how they derive reason, if it can be derived or if it can be attempted to be derived. Like I do think that's true.
What do you mean they could be wrong?
So I guess the question I think I'm kind of leaning towards is, do you think it's fair to say that like any subjective evaluation is more correct than another one, or is it all just preferences all the way down? I guess that's kind of what I'm leaning towards.
In terms of, or in the context of morality and ethics.
No, I'm talking about any
preferences.
any value statement. Period. Doesn't have to be morality ethics, because I don't see why it would operate differently.
I don't know what Okay, then you have to clarify your distinction between morality and value system. I don't understand.
No. I guess I'm saying anytime anybody makes any value judgment, right?
What's a value?
No. I think you're misinterpreting which meaning of the word value I mean, right? So like if somebody says I like this soda and somebody says I don't like this soda, right? So it's like I'm open to saying, okay, those are both opinions, and you guys have different taste buds, so that's probably fair, right? So there are some times where value judgments are pretty fungible, right? It doesn't really mean a lot. I can't really say you're wrong or right. There are all these reasons to think why it's more personalizable. And then if somebody like says in like a very serious voice that they are like pro ethnic cleansing, and then I'm like, okay, well that seems pretty bad and based on hateful views. It's like you could say that's just a preference, and then like I think it's fair to say like there is something logically wrong with their perception of the world that leads to their bad value judgments, right? Like they have decided to base their actions on this sorts of okay. If they said they're pro ethnic genocide and they believed it was moral, I would say like yes, you're allowed to believe that's moral, but they're wrong for thinking it's moral, not just because I feel differently, but because here's something more to it. And I would hedge it back and say, as we've noted in the first 20 minutes of this episode, about objectivity being strained in certain ways. So the literal circumstances to make something objective in this philosophical way aren't possible. But I would say, knowing the things we know, we can still derive things that are more ethical than other things, and reason backs how you derive that. And being pro-ethnic genocide purely on base alone fails that test. And it's not just my preference. It's if you reason through these arguments, one of them is unreasonable and one is reasonable. And it's not my preference that it's reasonable. It's more than that. Now you're kind of saying opinions are only preferences, and I'm saying that misses the point. I think that's where we clearly diverge.
Okay, so I'm just gonna use the example you used. If I have two statements, one, I support ethnic cleansing, and two, Sprite is my favorite soda. I am equating those two statements. Now, obviously, one of them has a greater impact on other people than the first statement has greater or the statement regarding ethnic cleansing has a greater impact than the statement about Sprite being my favorite soda, right? But I'm saying there is no fundamental difference between those two statements, because if you say there is, then again I think you have to demonstrate where you're getting that major difference. And then go back to what I said about how we're defining right, how we're defining wrong. Ultimately, so I guess it is preferences all the way down to answer your earlier question. I mean, that's fine. It doesn't bother me, actually. It doesn't really bother me at all. If I read about, in the 8th grade, or seventh or 8th grade, In English class, we did a really long a unit on studying Nazi Germany, right? I think we had to read the Diaries of Anne Frank, or we had to read some books and maybe even make a presentation about it. I've forgotten the details, but obviously, when I was reading about what Nazi Germany did, I had this, I have a feeling, and I still do if I read about it or watch documentaries or whatever, still a feeling of like visceral disgust. And that preference means a great deal to me, but it is still ultimately a preference, and to call it truth, people do call it truth. I mean, you might not, and I respect you for that. But the people who do say, yes, my morals are true, and here's why, I don't respect them, because I don't think they're acknowledging what's really going on here, which is preferences.
Yeah, I think I'm a little sympathetic in the sense that I get how you get there. I just don't find the lack of like objective in the philosophical sense as disqualifying as you do, and I find the disqualifying nature of that like painfully arbitrary. And I know like all opinions are arbitrary, but I've spent this whole episode making the claim that like just because we know things are subjective and arbitrary doesn't mean they're equal, right? That's kind of the point I'm trying to hit home. So it's like and you just essentially agreed with that by saying, hey, these are both preferences. That doesn't really mean they're equal for whatever reason. And I guess what I'm kind of getting at is I think there's more to it, and I think
I said they are equal. I'm sorry to interrupt, Matt. I don't mean to be rude, but I was saying those statements are equal in my. Okay, I was just making sure.
Yeah, I think we're using the word equal differently there. But okay, that's aside the point. I mean, if somebody tells you, two different people, one tells you Sprite's their favorite soda, and the other guy says, I want to ethnically genocide a race, you wouldn't go, oh, that's cool to both people. That's what I meant when you're saying, oh, I didn't mean it in like the philosophical, this equals this. But I guess what I'm getting at is I just don't find that high bar of objective reality beyond human comprehension to actually be necessary, in the sense that it's almost like setting the standard so unreasonably high that of course nothing can meet it, so of course everything is preferences. And I think that's like arbitrary. I think in the sense of I don't get why that standard should be that. I get why people would set it as a standard, like as an intuition, because it's the highest it could be would be a sort of absolute truth and certainty that humans can't reach. And it's like, okay, well, I get how that'd be cool aspirationally, but it's like we understand human cognition, and we understand like all these things about how humans act and how they think and how we reason through other things, right? Like we use reason in all sorts of other realms to problem solve and figure things out, and we suss out all sorts of arguments through value judgments and pitting them together. And I just don't think that I mean, it's unfair to say preferences understates it, because you don't get to choose the tone of certain words. Like, and I think that's why a lot of people get tripped up in this conversation, because you calling them preferences would trigger some people. It's like, and so I don't think that's a fair point. It's just I think that understates how much more valuable, and I guess true is a trigger word, but it's like evidence based certain points can be. So if somebody told me my moral worldview is based on, and then I make up another stupid example, then you'd be like, that's not very evidence based. That's arbitrary and like a David Lynchian randomness way absurdity. And then somebody else said, I use this as my moral standard because I know our human experience isn't perfect, but it's the best guiding point we have. It's like, okay, this person is saying something that is at least based on something, and they're posing this with uncertainty to some degree, because we always have uncertainty, but it seems to be the best axiom. It's like, I don't want to accidentally equate those for the same reason I won't equate somebody telling me something stupid with something intelligent or helpful and not helpful. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm open to hearing all sorts of moral views, but then I want to hear why. And I don't think the whys are necessarily equal just because they're subjective, or they have a level of subjectiveness to their nature. Like, some subjective points are better than other subjective points. That's something that I've experienced every day of my life in all sorts of moments, and is clearly okay. So I just don't see why morality is exempt just because people choose to think about objectivity. So that's kind of, I guess, my concluding thought. I know we've rambled a bit, so maybe you can wrap it up and say, you're wrong. That's more than fine. I think we actually, I think this turned out fairly well, to be honest.
So, well, okay. Well, I mean, if I don't like, I mean, I could use the word truth. I could use the word proof. I could use the word evidence based, or use the phrase evidence based. I mean, I think all these things, truth, proof, and evidence based, I don't think they apply to ethical claims. I don't think someone could say, I have evidence that Nazi Germany was wrong. I think I think you're appealing to emotions, you're appealing to preferences, you're appealing to desires, and that's sort of, I guess, where we're stuck with. And I don't even think my bar is too high, but I think I'm like trying to hammer this point home in an annoying way because, for all my life, pretty much for the totality of human history, people are always asserting, yes, I have this moral truth, and here's why. And that's why religious wars happen. That's why political issues are so divisive. And I'm not saying like I'm not looking for some like communal harmony or anything when I say these things. I'm just saying that everyone seems to think their morals are the right morals and other people's morals are the wrong morals. But I have yet to hear any good arguments for why any of them. Well, why why these statements are proven and why. I don't know. I mean, again, I don't know what the measuring stick is. In some ways, these words just don't like these statements don't even they're almost meaningless to me. And they're only meaningful in a sort of like pragmatic sense that, if a country exists, then a country has to have economic policy and social policy. Or if we live in a, so I'm a university student, I live in a dorm room. It's like, well, if you have any group of people at all, you have to have some rules or some regulations. You have to do something, to make it run somewhat smoothly. But again, I'm awaiting to hear, hear the arguments for why I should believe in moral realism or moral rationalism, because I think most people do believe in, that there are certain moral truths. I think most philosophers, in fact, believe that there are certain moral truths out there. And I think it's very comforting to believe that there are certain moral truths. I think it's very disconcerting to suggest we might live in a universe where morals mean absolutely nothing except, in a very limited utilitarian, not utilitarian, a very limited pragmatic sense, a very that they could be useful, in the context of human affairs, but that has nothing to do with knowledge. You can't have knowledge. You can't have moral knowledge. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, if we were going to deal like another hour on it, I'm not going to try to make claims. I'm just going to try to. I want to list a few things that would probably be the direction it would go. It'd probably have to do with like evidence is a word you used. That is like, I think one of the things that muddies it, right? So I know you said that like you don't feel like you have a ridiculously high standards in this situation, but I think part of what is implicit to what I'm saying is in value judgments, the things that are similar to evidence are not it's not the same as a mathematical proof, and I'm okay with that, and I don't really find that problematic, and I think that's where we end up kind of starting to diverge. So I think like the standard of evidence and why would probably be like the realm to investigate next. So it's like what would be required in a more Like we'd have to sit back and think about it. And it's like, why do I feel like this framework's okay? What level of evidence do I need? What is this literally trying to prove something? And I think the other thing that might be making this conversation muddier is all the examples we have to give are based on like conclusion statements that people would say. But imagine if we were building a framework, I know you're rejecting that, but like all the claims about like genocide is bad would be like 50 lines down, right? So you'd have to like make all sorts of points, and then it would follow from those points, right? That genocide is bad for whatever reason. It could be because it's like you end up with some pro autonomy position. It could be because you end up in some anti suffering position. So I guess what I'm saying is the reason why all these opinion statements would be based on moral framework is what ended up this thing is bad statement, but you don't get to literally and therefore this thing is bad. It's more of like you would end up trying to reason out certain axioms, and then I can't help but think that our whole disagreement is just based on our difference reaction to what is required in evidence. And I kind of think that you'd still have to answer for what it means for there to be no right or wrong. I think that's maybe the only place I'm truly unsatisfied. And if we had another hour, I would maybe would want to hear you think about that and maybe deliver it in a way that would make sense in my brain. Because I think I'm doing a poor job communicating to you what I mean when I'd say that would require something. So yeah, okay, I'll let you jump in and then we'll sign off. Sorry.
I mean, I guess to be brief, again, I think we can try to accommodate, people's preferences. I think it's again. Well, I mean, this goes back to again. I'm such a broken record tonight. I'm sorry, folks, but the issue with Thomas Hobbes' theory of the state of nature was, this sounds off topic, but it's relevant. The issue was he claimed that the state in the state of nature, man is like solitary, and man wants to avoid other. Men want to avoid other men, or humans want to avoid other humans unless they can dominate them, unless they can, they need something from them. They need food. They need their cave or something, unless but man is by nature not a social animal, and he has to become molded into a social animal by, an all powerful sovereign. And what I'm saying is, no, man is a social animal. And therefore, obviously, we're going to have some rules to live by to make sure that social organization doesn't collapse. And, there's if I have to put forward some argument, I guess I would say it would be in your own rational interest. It's your own, it's in your own self-interest to not want your, community to just collapse into chaos. And certain rules are necessary for that. But again, that has absolutely nothing to do with truth. I deeply resent, this is one reason I dislike Jordan Peterson. I deeply resent his insistence that usefulness has anything to do with truthfulness. Or that usefulness equals truthfulness. That's the pragmatic point. That's the point William James and John Dewey, that's the kind of point they would make regarding their theory of knowledge. And I'm saying, no, that's a self-serving theory of knowledge. And that just allows people to say, I mean, I could point to some culture, that has views that Americans think are atrocious, and I could say, well, it works. Their society is functioning. Their society is stable. Doesn't mean it's true or moral or right. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I think that might be a thing I want to talk about in the future, because I think there's a starting point that might be interesting to you. And I think if it's framed from the lens of it's not supposed to be true, It's just given the limited nature, these are things that would approximate something that seems to be more often than not borderline universally true. Then maybe that'd be an interesting way of looking at some things in a cultural historical sense. But that's a whole nother rabbit hole. But as we're at, I hope you all enjoyed listening to this episode of Beyond Talking Points. We've definitely done some stuff on subjective and objective, like worldviews and reality and stuff like that in the past, and I think I don't know. I think this one was different in a good way, or at least I tried to skip over stuff that I just was like, we're not looking at it through the lens of this thing, so why talk about it? But this is an interesting one, especially because I could see it triggering people because of how tough it is to know what people intend to say when they use certain words, and I think that ends up being like the inherent failure of human communication. So hopefully we did an okay job trying to like even Matt knows I tried not to use the word true because I was trying to suss out the difference between like the sort of arguments that religious people appeal to in terms of objectivity compared to what I'm saying, which I think is rooted in experience, so inherently subjective, but I still think there is a distinction, et cetera, et cetera. But that's beyond the point. If you guys enjoyed listening to this episode, we have a whole 79 other episodes on all sorts of other stuff. All sorts of topics from politics to political philosophy to anarchy, utopia, blah, 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 all sorts of stuff. And you can find more Matt's content, The Philosopher's Guide to the Apocalypse. He's done some content there. He's done some long form interviews and discussions similar to the ones here, and he's investigated thoughts on his own in pretty interesting ways, especially covering topics that I don't make time for because I'm too much of a snob to take interest in his ideas when I'm being lazy and say, no, I listen to something on this topic. Matt, we're going to talk about it whether you like it or not. You can go talk about this thing on your own podcast. And then on my end, you can find some more content on the Obey podcast, which hopefully I'll be getting around to doing some more stuff eventually. I like saying that every week because the more I say it, it feels like a reoccurring bit. So I'm just gonna keep saying that every time. I'm on Twitter at Matthew T. Keck. Matt's on Twitter at Matthew Hazel WO8. You can find him there. I don't think either of us use it that much. Every now and then I'll send like 8 in a row, and they'll just be about football. And you'll be like, can't believe Matt watches football. I thought he only watches the movie Castaway based on his examples and his arguments with Matt. Okay, anything else you want to add on, or is that all the plugs? Okay, well, I'll take that as a no. Okay, so I hope you guys enjoyed listening. Tune in next week when we argue about more stuff. And sign off for now is Matt. Thank you.